The global pandemic has hit us hard, from learning about all the deaths, social distancing, and the uncertainty of not knowing when it will all end. The effects of the COVID pandemic on minority children are fascinating and worth exploring. And with this sudden and drastic life changes, children react to them differently from adults. Just to start off a little bit, I wanted to say, how about you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm James Graham. I'm a professor of psychology at the College of New Jersey. I research children's social and emotional development. So a lot of the work that I do, I am involved with school systems and I help them evaluate the effectiveness of their programs. I teach a number of courses to undergraduates. I've been at the college for, over 21 years, 22 years. I lose count. It's been a while.
Okay. To better help minorities and underserved families, researchers like yourself present and share valuable insights on your findings to the public. Can you share with the audience why this information is essential to minority families and organizations that serve them?
Well, I think the work that I do, it involves social and emotional development of children. And I think that the work is important because you have to understand that a child, yes, is an individual, but that child exists in the context of relationships with families, with schools, communities, as well as culture. And so the work that I do, I think is important because it tries to connect those different systems. It's interesting to examine an individual child and what happens in terms of his or her development, but in the absence of that context, how does that child interact with the family? How does the school impact the child? How does culture impact the child? And the fact that I work with children of color, we really have to look at the importance of culture and those social policies because it really affects all those different levels. So that's really a significant part of why the work that I do is significant, and it's obviously always very challenging in the context that we're in because a lot of the work that's been done on children and their families and schools has changed in the COVID epidemic or our pandemic that we're in.
Oh, well, talking about the pandemic, there's been a major shift in how kids interact with each other because before they were going to schools, they were on the playground and stuff like that. And now they have to actually learn from home and learn from a screen pretty much. How does that affect a child, especially a minority child?
Well, I think unfortunately the consequences are pretty negative for all children right now who have to social distance, who can't really go to school. They're doing this virtual learning. I think the research is showing that kids are really lagging behind academically. If you think about it, it's hard to get kids motivated to learn on a screen. And this, I say especially for children of color in this pandemic, a lot of their families could be their parents or their grandparents, given the statistics of how COVID has hit minority communities. They're doing all this in the face of loss. And a lot of these parents are either essential workers and they're not home to really supervise their kids and to motivate their kids. So kids are often frustrated even in person classes. And then the fact that you don't have those resources and that support, I think, can really be more challenging for children to sort of remain motivated. And they're doing this in the context of their parents working or having a loss of a parent or grandparent. I think, psychologically, cognitively, mentally, I think can be very, very draining to these kids in particular.
Okay. You studied the child development scenarios of minority children and how it differs or similar to their counterparts. Can you speak to how the pandemic has changed the economic environment for minority children?
Well, I would say economically, the community has really been hit hard, especially from the things that I've seen, children of color. Well, all kids have been hit hard. We know that a lot of families, if you look at it, are out of work. You know, they're working and they're getting unemployment benefits. But even in that, you're starting to see, or you're seeing, families that are food insecure. And you see with the work that I do in various communities across the state of New Jersey, a lot of these families are children of color, Latin families, African American families, very food insecure. And I think that a lot of these parents are essential workers. Maybe they're taking on, you know, trying to get more work because maybe a spouse or someone else in the family has lost a job. So it's really hitting them hard. A lot of kids are, you know, not eating as much because they're not going to school where they were getting reduced lunches or breakfast. And even if schools are serving that, let's say once a week or twice a week, you still have to go to that particular site to get the food. It varies from location to location. Some communities, they're busing food to kids. But that's a big change, and I think when you don't have those resources with all of the economic uncertainty, it's quite a challenge for children of color.
Okay. So in that vein also, how do you feel, or not, maybe not feel, but how do you, based on your research, kids cope with this type of change? Because it's like, you know, they would go to school or they have after-school program. As you're saying, you know, families losing their jobs, not having a lot of food. How do you think they see themselves in the world in that?
And I'm a researcher who focuses on the challenges as well as the positives, so I don't want to just dwell on the negatives. But in this case, unfortunately, I think a lot of kids sort of internalize a lot of these problems, a lot of these issues. They may see themselves more negatively, like, you know, why me? Why is this happening to my community? So their self-esteem can be negatively affected and impacted by this. And I think in terms of coping, when you have lost that self-esteem or that sense of self, a lot of kids may become more withdrawn. Some of them may externalize their behavior where they become more aggressive. They may, in many ways, become dependent on the people in their family more so, or they look for other avenues outside of the family, but they're trying to find some connection. But I think some kids also experience a high rate of depression. I think we're seeing that across the board for all kids, the increasing anxiety and depression that kids are facing. I think a lot of that is because they don't have the coping skills, because, you know, they're not very experienced in the world, and so they're adopting a lot of these strategies that they're seeing adults maybe in their family are sort of dealing with, and they're sort of dealing with that as well, and don't really have the resources or the outlets to, you know, demonstrate it. And as a result, especially I'm seeing with adolescents, unfortunately, the high rate is death by suicide. We're starting to see high rates of that, unfortunately, not with the younger kids. I think, I'm sure that it's on their mind, but in terms of actual death by suicide, unfortunately, what we're seeing with high schoolers and even college-age students, there's a high rate of that.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, the COVID has pretty much hit very hard to these kids.
Because I think if you think about the lack of connection, you know, the adolescents and kids, they want their peers. They want to interact with them. And I think for adolescents especially, where the social world is so great for them, that's their world, they're not able to engage in those activities that one would normally do. You know, there's the clubs that they can be involved in, the sports, the even going to the mall to meet their friends, or, you know, whatever. All of that is lacking, and I think to deal with that isolation, that loneliness, that depression, a lot of them, they want that pain to go away, and without the proper coping skills or mechanism or resources, many of them feel the best way to deal with it is death by suicide.
Yeah. We've talked more before about how kids are constantly on their cell phones, using social media, Instagram and Facebook and all that stuff, when there was no pandemic.
Right.
But, think about it now, we never realized how much social interaction, in-person interaction, we actually need as a human being just to get through our day and to get through life in general, to cope with hard times and so on and so forth. Could you talk a little bit more about that difference between what we think the kids are on their cell phones a lot, and then now they have the opportunity now, and that's the only way to actually interact with the world is through a screen, right, versus what they were able to do.
Yeah, I think that this social media is a misnomer. I don't think that it really is as social as people think it is. Mm-hmm. In many ways, this social media, and I think we're starting to see this in the age of pandemic and Zoom classes, virtual learning, that it really doesn't always connect you in the ways that you think it does. In-person kind of social interaction, you're gaining a lot more. You're getting a lot of the non-verbal kind of interaction and contact. And when you're on a screen, you miss that. The interpretation of what is truly being said. Yeah. I think are missing that. It doesn't, sort of substitute what a real relationship is. And I think that when adolescents and kids are on social media, I don't think it's always just for the social connection. I think it's more for status. I think a lot of adolescents are on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok to get likes. And I think it's a fake kind of status or social connection. And I find that the more adolescents and kids are on that, and this research supports this, the higher rates of those kind of interactions, it's really linked to self-esteem and self-worth. And when you don't get the number of likes or positive ratings, I think sometimes you devalue who you are. You feel less than. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of that. And if that's all adolescents and kids have, and they're using that to sort of elevate their sense of self, it's really adding to this anxiety and to this depression that we're seeing.
Yikes. So I want to talk about a little bit the isolation, because when the pandemic came out, we had to, go in lockdown and all that. And I know that some families, some minority families, have family issues besides the pandemic, besides work, and besides socioeconomic issues. How do children in that age, from kids to adolescents, deal with that kind of situation, being, around your parents all the time? Not only that, having your parents be your teacher, that's another, where's that separation? Having that separation, you were able to go to school, to hang out with your friends and be social, but now the only people you hang out with is, mom and dad.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes both ways. I think there's a group of kids that are probably not happy. Then they have to interact with, their parents like that. And that's the easy route. But I see some positives with this as well, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I think some kids are happy that they have that quality time with the parent, because maybe a lot of them didn't have it before. So let's say a parent did get laid off. There's probably a lot of stress that parent is experiencing, but there's also more time that child has with the parent that maybe wasn't there before. So I think it really provides the opportunity for kids to reestablish these connections with parents. I think it can take some of the stress off of a kid being with the family, because not all schools are very supportive of kids of color. A lot of kids go to school and it's stressful for them. If you think about a child of color especially, going into a school where oftentimes they're viewed as need some special resources, or they're in special education, or they have aggressive behavior. They're sort of labeled with that. And if they don't have to go to school and they're in the context of a family, it could be positive for them where they can take away some of those barriers that schools provide and put in front of them, and they can actually learn and adapt in cope in more adaptive ways, maybe with the family. So it's not always bad.
Yeah, and understand themselves a little bit more, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms of their identity and who they are. And I think that when you go to a school, you know, people pretty much have a label or an identity for you. And a lot of kids feel that they have to sort of put on this front, or they have to be tough in that school environment to protect themselves. And maybe they can sort of uncover and let go of some of those layers if they're at home.
So let's talk a little bit about the effects of the COVID-19 virus. And I know we want to put this in positive aspects, and, you know, the positive.
I mean, I want to be realistic as well.
Absolutely.
So I mean, there's negatives and there are positives, but so I just want to provide a balanced view of it, because too many times I think when you talk about children of color, it's often as what they don't have, and I don't want to further perpetuate this kind of victim kind of role, or they're less than. They're whole beings, and I think that we have to look at not only the negatives, but, you know, what the positives are as well. So that's all.
Absolutely. COVID has decimated a lot of families and stuff like that, and a lot of minority children, you know, deal with death in a different way than, you know, white families. What are some of the aspects of that coping mechanism and understanding of death through COVID and through other ways?
So I've published a couple of articles on children's understanding of death and dying. And generally speaking, children in the United States, because this could vary culturally, but kids within the United States often understand the finality of death by the age of 10. And I think that if you look at this across different communities in the United States, in, let's say, certain urban environments or environments that may be lower socioeconomically, kids often face or deal with death at much younger, earlier ages than a lot of other kids do. And I think that a lot of these findings probably are not applicable to all kids. I think kids in certain communities face this earlier, and I think that COVID has really pushed this understanding of death earlier, which is unfortunate. I think the kids understand if they have lost a parent or an aunt or an uncle, if we, you know, at this point over 525,000 or, you know, and up have died from COVID, the majority people of color. So kids are dealing with death many times over in their families. And so I think they understand that it's not, something that you can reverse. So it's irreversible. It's something that is inevitable, is going to happen. So a lot of these things that we try to shield our children from in this country, I don't think we can shield them from that in the context of COVID. So they're dealing with this earlier and earlier. And I think that the way we process the grief, a lot of kids probably modeled that from what they're seeing in, their family and all of that. And so it's a lot to deal with. And to add on to that, I think that probably contributes to a lot of the depression and the anxiety and all that the kids are facing. And, anytime we all watch news, I hope the kids avoid the news, but in reality, I know kids often see the news, and if you turn on any channel, that's all they talk about. They're doing a countdown of the number of people that have died, so it's really hard to shield our kids from that. So I think they're really dealing with the harsh consequences of death in this pandemic.
Okay. Being that the families are now closer together than they would before because everybody's running around doing their own thing. What are some of the positive aspects of that happening in a sense of a minority family, coping with that? Because before, mom and dad had to go work constantly outside of the house, and the kid would have to, they drop the kid off at school, they drop the kid off at a neighbor's house and stuff like that. But now mom and dad is at home. Now there's more time to connect with the family, have family dinners and all that. How does that help with their development and their social being?
So I would think that with any family, whether it's a mom and dad, a single parent, two dads, two moms, whatever family, that this kind of interaction, I think, is positive for the child. It creates more positive routines for a child. I think it helps in terms of his or her sense of self, to be around someone in a positive family that shows you love and care, and it's there that you can really rely on. It provides a sense of security. I think that maybe some kids, were not, facing, knowing that a parent, or it could be a grandparent, not necessarily a parent, they're there, and there's that structure. I think kids, regardless of community, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, they want structure. So maybe this pandemic and more caregivers being home, for example, it's providing a structure within the family that some kids maybe never had. And I think that by having that, it definitely elevates, their sense of self and makes them a little more independent and comfortable doing new things. Because when you feel better about yourself, you have a little more courage to try something new and to do more.
Yeah. The one thing that actually gets me a little, well, maybe not so much riled up, but often you hear on television, we have to get back to normal or get back to where, how we used to be. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has done is slowed us down so that we can, in some sense, focus on family. And my fear is when, everybody has the vaccine and, we're semi back to normal, things may go back to where it was. And I'm hoping that, the business world and, economically, people are in a good place. As many people as possible are in a good place where they can actually focus a little bit more on family and be home and stuff like that. But on the negative side of things, what would happen? Well, you may not know specifically what would happen, but what do you feel may happen to a child development now having to switch back to the the way it used to be? Okay, mom and dad, we're getting out the door. Right. Grab your book bag. I'm going to drop you off at school, and I'm going to go to work, and I only see you in the afternoons to have a quick bite to eat and then go to bed. Yeah,
and I don't like the term back to normal, personally. I think I don't think that's a good thing in the sense that it wasn't good for kids. We can see all of the pandemic has really showed us all of the holes in our system across families, across government, across socioeconomically. So I don't want to get back to normal. I want there to be a new definition of normal. So I would say, to answer your question, that what will happen, in my opinion, and based on some research as well, that once kids go back to school, I think that schools, meaning administrators, teachers, they're going to have to deal with a lot of social and emotional challenges in the kids. And I think they will deal with those challenges, and some that are back in session now, because some schools they're out of the lockdown or they're back in, in-person classes. Because those routines that were established during COVID, being at home and all of that, those are gone for a lot of kids now. So now they're being thrust into this in-person environment, And it takes a while to really get adjusted to that.
Yeah.
And so kids, they're learning, and especially children of color, who lack the resources that schools provided, they're going back into a school system where their reading levels or grades have really suffered because of this pandemic. And it's especially true of kids in lower resource communities, lower income communities. They're academically, we just know they pretty much lost almost a year. And so to go back, kids are going to be frustrated when they are encountering other kids who may be at different levels. They're starting to compare themselves to their peers. They may act out because they're not happy with things. They may act out aggressively. You may start to see some kids really withdraw. So I think that schools have to be prepared to deal with those social and emotional issues, and they have the resources and the support to take that on.
Well, actually, the good thing is your research will help these administrators and these teachers to be able to identify what are some of the issues that are causing some of these acting out of the students and all that.
Right, and so this is why with the research and the work that I do, we look not only at the individual child, this is why I think it's important to look at the child within all of those contexts, because you see the connections among those different levels, and so this gives us a clearer picture of what's really going on. So any kind of intervention or program that we do is really effective, because if you work on one piece and ignore the other pieces, it's not going to be really good. So I think as psychologists or people that work with kids in the school system or guidance counselors, they all have to work together across all of these systems, working with the parents, the communities, the kids, et cetera, to look at all of these different social and emotional issues such as what kind of decisions are the kids making? How do they view themselves? How do they see others? How is their self-esteem? What kind of climate is the school providing? Because oftentimes schools, they create a culture that's incompatible or mismatched with what the kid really wants. But schools, they really need to take a deeper dive into all of that. So that's the challenge, I think, that a lot of schools are going to face. You can't go back to normal. It has to be a new normal.
Absolutely, absolutely. So my last question to you, Dr. Graham, is what can our viewers that's watching this, what can they do to help their families, help friends to educate themselves on helping with coping with COVID, getting out of the COVID situation, going back into the world, as some people may say, and going back to, well, not going back, but developing a new normal?
Yeah. Well, I would say that we're all in this together, and I think that we've been so isolated, socially isolated, isolated from families, from friends, etc. I think that once this is all lifted and we're able to socially interact again, I think we have to start taking advantage of those resources out there, and we need to ask for help. We have to understand we don't have to do all this alone. There are community resources, school resources, support groups. If you need help, people need to ask for it and just sort of reach out. I think we need more empathy. Hopefully this COVID-19 has really helped us understand the plight of others and appreciate others more. Hopefully that's something kids will get as well. But I think we need to just reach out and take advantage of the resources that are there, that are available. And I think it's not only the individual needs to do that, but I think that communities and schools need to reach out to kids, to parents. I think it goes both ways. Everybody needs to work with each other and support each other.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.